Well, let's stay with this story because I'm joined in the studio by Dr. Dibyesh Anand, who's an expert in politics and international relations at the University of Westminster, and James Lowe of the London School of Economics and a member of the Hong Kong Overseas Institute. Gentlemen, a very good morning to you. Let's start by looking at the language that these three men have actually used in turning themselves over to the authorities, because they've said, we're going to turn ourselves in and confess to our crimes of unauthorised public assembly and incitement to take part in unlawful assembly. They've pretty much condemned themselves before any legal proceedings have taken place.
I mean, this is a magnificent political strategy on their part. I think the Hong Kong population requires a relatively more moderate protest movement in order to gather support, and I think that's the only way they could have approached it to gain the maximum amount of support from the public at this time.
So how do you think they'll be treated by the authorities in light of this very public confession and the declaration that they're going to turn themselves over to the authorities without being arrested and being hunted down?
See, in fact, as we can see that there are different divisions within the Occupy movement and the protesters in Hong Kong. And one of the factors that these are the people who are actually believe strongly in rule of law. So they want, or they may be wanting to expose the rule of law in Hong Kong by saying that, okay, we are surrendering and treat us the way you should be treating us. Now, the dilemma with the government would be, if they treat these people harshly, then it would expose the government as not respecting rule of law. If they treat them very lightly, then that may encourage more protesters in the future. So there is a dilemma that Hong Kong government faces here.
A dilemma, but the interesting thing as well is that China presumably would want the toughest sentence going, because they would say, look, these men need to be punished given what has happened, but also any sentence has to be symbolic.
Yep, and I think that's important because when you look at the divisions between the protest movements at this time, so you have the Hong Kong Federation students and scholarism taking a relatively more radical stance and saying we need to continue with hunger strikes, we need to continue to be on the streets, and they're still evaluating what the next steps are. And what's happening right now is you'll see quite a lot of students demonizing the Occupy founders for the fact that they're surrendering, because it seems like there hasn't been even symbolic progress in what we're doing. So it does seem that this is not a legitimate strategy in their view. So if a tougher sentence goes down on them, and it does seem to show the Occupy movement fails in a sense, it would then create the divisions that the Chinese government does want to see between these protest movements. I think that
but at the same time, if you look at the much wider picture on these protests, it almost appears as if these three men triggered this movement for all the right reasons from their perspective, but in many ways they were very naive. They hadn't quite reckoned on these disparate forces and what people wanted. In other words, they assumed everybody was singing from the same hymn sheet.
Yeah, in fact, when you look at most protest movements across the world, that's always a phenomenon, that you have certain people who either take up the leadership position or they get seen as leaders by wider public, but then the movement gets more radicalized. Now, in Hong Kong, what we have seen is that much of the movement is extremely cautious. So they are very non-violent. They're very peaceful throughout. It is the Hong Kong police that have been violent from time to time, like in the recent days. Now, when we look at what Beijing would want, you ask the question, would it want a harsh sentence? The dilemma that Beijing faces is that if it gives or if Hong Kong government gives harsh sentence to these people, that sends out a message to wider population that even this kind of moderate, very peaceful demand would be dealt with harshly. That may radicalize the people even more. So right now, I'm sure Beijing would be in dilemma itself, whether to be harsh or whether to be shown as compromising.
I mean, it's a game of chess which is being played out here, and let's stick with that theme, because you've had some of the student leaders who said, look, we want to continue negotiations, we want to have talks with the authorities, but what is the point of any talks, given that as far as the authorities are concerned, look, we are not moving from our position. No change, this is it, take it or leave it.
I think in many ways the protest movement is caught in a dilemma. So it's very difficult for them to push on without having serious escalations, for example, going to more aggressive or violent even actions in order to pressure for some kind of change. But at the same time, if they want to go for moderate negotiations, that's exactly the result we're looking at. The problem is that the Hong Kong population are already turning against these activists. So it's very difficult for these negotiations to not be the single way out, because otherwise they would just be completely demonized public and have no legitimacy whatsoever. So I think what they're trying to do is at least reopen some form of talks, so we know where the baseline of the Hong Kong government is, because at the moment, in terms of public rhetoric, they will always say we don't want to concede whatsoever. So I think that's in a way of testing what the Hong Kong government actually wants.
And you can't really look at this in isolation, because you've also got events happening in Taiwan, because you've got the leader there who wanted to forge these much closer ties with Beijing. That has been rejected. So perhaps that's putting the pressure on Beijing as well in terms of the strategy it has to use dealing with the Hong Kong issue.
You see, Beijing think, in a sense, it's a very, I would say, very clever and even cunning system, because remember, we are dealing with a government that manages 1.3 billion plus population, and to be honest, Hong Kong and Taiwan are very important, but still not as important as what happens in Beijing or Shanghai. So the wider strategy for Chinese government is to prevent any kind of spillover effect from Hong Kong kind of pro-democracy movement into China. In Taiwan, they can't really control it. As you pointed out, the not pro-Beijing, but relatively pro-Beijing political leaders, they're suffering because people in Taiwan are getting more and more skeptical of Beijing. But the wider challenge for China is how to control the damage in terms of not letting that have a spillover effect within the mainland and controlling it. The way they're doing it is by demonizing, by dividing, and they're following very typical imperial colonial strategy of divide and rule. So they're dividing the movement in many different pieces. That's what their effort is. And this is why you see they want to, for instance, portray the Hong Kong protesters as somehow backed by the West, backed by Britain.
Sure.
Scapegoating.
Hence that parliamentary delegation, which they told them you're not welcome here, because again it plays into the imperialist narrative. But at the same time, it's not just dissuading people within China itself to get involved in rebellion, to take their cue from what's happening in Hong Kong. There's a lot at stake for the president too, because yes, he is very successful, but he also has enemies. So I'm sure the enemies will want him to fall on the Hong Kong issue.
It's very interesting because you look at the divisions within the Communist Party, even back in the 2012 election. So you had Henry Tang, who was backed by the majority of billionaires, but who was less supported in terms of like communist officials back then. And you'll then see now that the billionaires themselves are not necessarily voicing their opinions against the protests as critically as you would think they would. And I think the Communist Party is trying to prove both to these billionaires and the elites in Hong Kong society, as well as the middle class voters, who are the general sort of middle ground that we're looking at, that it's impossible to create a sustained pro-democracy movement that will be able to take down the decisions the National People's Congress makes. So they're actually convincing not just the enemies outside of China, but also those within, especially in Hong Kong, who are basically trying to fight for change.
But so far it does appear as if China has the upper hand in this so far. A slightly unfair question to put to both of you, but starting with you first, how do you feel that ultimately this is going to play itself out? Because clearly these protests cannot continue indefinitely.
It cannot continue indefinitely, but whenever we look at most of the, let's say, anti-colonial movements or let's say any kind of protest, it always goes up and down. So the fact that, for instance, let's say if the protests get cracked down, if things calm down in Hong Kong, calm down in the sense of what Beijing wants, not really what people want, it doesn't imply that it's the end of pro-democracy sentiments in Hong Kong. Long term, I do think that given the way China behaves so harshly, or so, is so sensitive about these issues, it is aware of the fact that beyond a point you cannot control people's aspirations, and people's aspirations likely to be in Hong Kong as well as in China is questioning the government because they would want more rights. So I'm more hopeful in the long term.
So you're hopeful in the long term. Do you share that view?
Yeah, I think in the short term we'll be looking at some form of withdrawal sooner or later. But the most important thing is we've achieved some form of civil awakening at the moment. You have a majority of middle-class voters in Hong Kong feeling like democracy is something they do want. The key is how the activists now manage it, because if they continue to radicalize, it will then start basically alienating a lot of the middle-class voters. And the fact that the pan-democratic politicians at the moment have been far less vocal compared to what people expect them to be might make them lose the next election. And if that happens, it will then create like massive problems for us. So I think it's vital that the activists now withdraw some kind of moral dignity and prove that their message from the beginning, when 100,000 people on the streets, was what they stood for throughout. That will then create the awakening necessary for us to have a sustained pro-democracy movement.
I have a feeling we'll be returning to this theme in the future. But gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us here on This Day Live. Thank you for your analysis.